You've been taught to expect transformation as spectacle, a thunderclap in the sky, fireworks announcing your breakthrough, a trumpet blast announcing the arrival of your new life. But the real shift, the one that actually rewrites your coordinates in the field, never arrives that way. It comes quietly. It comes like confusion. It comes like silence. It comes like stillness that you don't know what to do with. Pause, breathe. You wake up and nothing looks wrong, yet everything feels expired. The room hasn't changed, but you sense the walls are no longer your size. They're stitched together from versions of you that don't fit anymore, and you know it. Not because of drama or catastrophe, but because of the whisper inside, it's time to move. Not physically, not symbolically, but quantumly. This is the paradox of real jumping. It doesn't announce itself with banners and evidence. It announces itself with absence. Something vanishes. Some flavor disappears. You look at the familiar job, the familiar relationship, the familiar self, and suddenly it has no taste. It feels like bread left out on the counter, still intact, still there but lifeless. Most dismiss this as boredom, depression, or restlessness. But what if this is the indicator light? What if this stillness is not stagnation, but signal? Notice this: the biggest leaps of your life rarely start with fireworks. They start with frequency dissonance. You stop matching the room you're in, and that mismatch is not failure. It is preparation. The mind doesn't like this. The mind wants steps. It wants continuity. It wants a ladder where every rung is visible. But quantum jumping doesn't give you that. Quantum jumping says disappear from one orbit and reappear in another. No bridge, no staircase, no middle ground. And here's where most people misinterpret what's happening. They say, if I don't see evidence, then nothing is shifting. They confuse silence with absence, when silence is the very proof that the field is rearranging. Think of a theater right before the curtain rises. The crowd goes quiet, lights dim. That's not emptiness, that's anticipation, that's transition. Pause, breathe. You've felt it before, haven't you? A job that ended suddenly and left you floating, weightless, before something new found you. A relationship that cracked open, and instead of chaos, you felt strangely light, not devastated, just free. That wasn't a slow fade, that was a jump. Your body knew it. Your nervous system reorganized in an instant, and only afterward did your mind try to catch up. Quantum jumping is not a metaphor for positive thinking. It's not a poetic way to say believe in yourself. It is a measurable phenomenon, reflected in the way electrons move between energy states. They do not travel across a bridge. They vanish from one level and appear at another when enough energy is absorbed. Discontinuous transition. Physics names it plainly. You live it invisibly. Now, take this deeper. You are not only a biological body, you are a vibrational broadcast, a frequency emitter entangled with countless timelines that already exist. Every version of you is coded into the field, waiting for coherence. And every time you feel that silent misfit, that absence of taste, that strange lightness in the middle of endings, it is your field saying charge absorbed, jump ready. So why does transformation feel chaotic? Because you resist what has already happened. Your heart commits, your field aligns, but your mind lags behind with a clipboard trying to take notes. The mind whispers, slow down, think about the consequences, wait until there's proof. But the jump doesn't wait. It has already begun. Your only decision is whether to anchor it or abort it. When you fight it, when you rationalize, when you demand explanation, you stretch out the chaos. You create turbulence because you're holding on to the expired orbit. But when you release, when you accept that the silence is the signal, you collapse the distance between decision and destination. Pause, breathe. That's why today is not about waiting for more evidence. It's about learning to recognize the subtle doorway when it appears. Not an arch lit with neon, not a booming voice telling you now, but a whisper, a misfit, a presence of absence. And when you learn to see that for what it is, you stop calling it confusion. You call it initiation. This is the field diagnosis. Transformation doesn't look like victory. It looks like vacancy. It feels like space. It feels like neutrality. It feels like nothing until it feels like everything. So the question is not, when will I know it's time? The question is, will I recognize the silence when it comes? Because silence is not void. Silence is coordinates updating. Silence is the jump already in motion. And if you can hold yourself steady in that silence, if you can stop scrambling for proof, you'll discover something extraordinary. You don't chase the jump. You don't force it. You don't create it. You let it happen, because it already has. Now interrupt it. Your mind is trained to expect continuity, cause, effect. A neat little sequence you can map. But the universe doesn't always flow in straight lines. Sometimes it folds. Sometimes it collapses. Sometimes it rewires in ways that make no sense to the part of you that loves logic. Quantum mechanics offers a clue. In the lab, electrons don't crawl step by step to higher energy states. They vanish from one orbit and reappear in another. No midpoint, no bridge. Scientists call it a discontinuous transition. For the electron, there is no journey across. There is only here, then suddenly there. What does that mean for you? You are not separate from this principle. You are not outside the field. You are the field, embodied. Your identity, your habits, your broadcast of thoughts and emotions, all of them function as energetic states. And when you gather enough charge, enough coherence between your decision, your feeling, your action, you too jump, not metaphorically, literally. Pause, breathe. Think of it this way: when you cling to your old identity, you are like an electron locked in a low orbit. The old stories keep you anchored. The familiar emotions weigh you down. You can talk about change, dream about change, even visualize it endlessly. But until your field absorbs the energy required, nothing happens. You stay circling the same nucleus. But the moment enough coherence is reached, the leap doesn't ask permission. It doesn't need your linear checklist. It simply happens. You vanish from one state and appear in another. This is why transformation often feels instant, even if you prepared for years. It's why people can spend a decade saying, "One day I'll leave," and then, in a single morning, walk away with no doubt. This is not randomness. It is physics meeting psychology. The brain works with neural pathways, grooves carved by repetition. The field works with resonance, signals amplified by emotional congruence. When both align, the system reaches threshold, and then discontinuity. So how do you practice this? How do you prepare yourself to leap like the electron? It's not about building ladders, it's about building charge. You gather coherence until the field has no option but to relocate you. Consider coherence like tuning a radio station. If your thoughts are saying one thing, your emotions another, and your actions something else entirely, the signal is noisy. Static drowns the broadcast, but when thought, feeling, and action strike the same note clear, unwavering, the signal cuts through, the field hears it. That's the equivalent of the electron absorbing just enough energy to shift orbit. Pause, breathe. Most people wait for proof before they align. They want to see the new job offer before feeling free. They want the relationship to appear before choosing love. They want money in the bank before embodying abundance. That is backwards. The field doesn't respond to proof. It responds to broadcast. Proof follows signal, never the other way around. So practice this instead of asking, "What must I do to reach my new life?" Ask, "What state must I embody so that the field reorganizes around me?" When you align with that frequency not once, but consistently, you're replicating the electron's leap. There is no staircase to climb, no ritual calendar to complete. There is only the moment when your inner broadcast is unmistakable. When you stop being half committed, half anchored, half doubting. That moment is when the discontinuous transition occurs. And yes, it feels strange. It feels like walking out of one movie set and into another without crossing the hallway. One day you're surrounded by old conversations, old expectations, old limitations. The next day those conversations don't land. Those expectations dissolve. Those limitations evaporate. The people around you might even say, "You've changed overnight." But inside, you know it wasn't overnight. It was a buildup of coherence until the jump became unavoidable. Pause, breathe. You can test this in microform. Change your posture when you feel fear. Switch your breath when you feel doubt. Speak aloud a declaration that contradicts the old identity. Each of these is like adding energy to your orbit. Small charges that accumulate until the jump is triggered. Physics isn't separate from your evolution. It's the blueprint. And when you see your own transformation through this lens, you stop calling it luck or fate. You start calling it resonance. So remember, no bridge, no staircase, just relocation. Just broadcast. Just the instant reappearance of self in a higher orbit. And if you practice coherence with enough honesty, you won't need to wonder whether the jump is real. You'll feel the discontinuity. You'll live it. Hold that frequency. Here's the part most people miss: discomfort is not a problem to fix. It is a radar. It's the subtle technology of your nervous system announcing that your broadcast is shifting. When you feel restless, when you feel like the ground beneath you is both familiar and unbearable, that's not weakness. That's signal interference. Pause, breathe. Think of static on an old radio dial. You're halfway between two stations, fragments of both play at once. It sounds messy, almost painful. Most people twist the dial back toward the old station because at least the noise stops. They settle for familiarity over clarity. But you're learning to stay with the static long enough for the new station to lock in. This is why so many abandon their jump too early. The interference feels uncomfortable, so they call it failure. They say, "If I were really transforming, it would feel good." No. In truth, transformation feels like interference because your body is recalibrating. You are detaching from one orbit while not fully stabilized in the new. That mismatch is the radar letting you know you're on the threshold. So here's your new lens when discomfort rises. Don't rush to medicate it, justify it, or analyze it. Recognize it as evidence that your signal is in transit. The inner radar is beeping, not to punish you, but to guide you. Pause, breathe. Consider the moments you've felt this radar before. The last days of a job where showing up drained you in ways you couldn't or explain. The uneasy silence after ending a relationship where you still cared, but knew you couldn't stay. The nervous energy before moving to a new city, even though nothing was forcing you out. In every case, the discomfort wasn't random. It was your inner radar saying your frequency is no longer compatible with this orbit. The mistake is interpreting static as a no. Static is not rejection, it's interference. It's evidence that two signals are crossing. The old self still broadcasting. The new self beginning to hum. Your job is not to panic. Your job is to let the interference confirm your tuning. This is why meditation feels so chaotic at first. You sit in silence, and instead of peace, you feel every restless thought, every itch, every surge of impatience. You think you're failing, but in reality, you're hearing the static that was always there. You're simply quiet enough to notice it. That awareness is the radar working, telling you where coherence has yet to land. Pause, breathe. Here's the shift. Instead of fleeing discomfort, decode it. Ask, what is this interference trying to tell me? Is it pointing to an old identity still rehearsing itself? Is it reminding me that my new broadcast is inconsistent? Is it simply marking the friction of transition? When you ask these questions, the static transforms from enemy to ally. And once you see discomfort as radar, you stop fearing it. You stop seeing it as evidence of failure. You start seeing it as proof that something is recalibrating beneath the surface. That is why your nervous system lights up when you're close to a leap. It's not warning you to retreat. It's bracing you for relocation. So the next time you feel that unease, the tightness in your chest, the restlessness in your bones, the sense that nothing fits, even though nothing is wrong, I want you to remember this is the hum of your jump preparing to lock in. Don't mislabel it. Don't try to silence it with distractions. Don't call it failure, call it guidance. Pause, breathe. Your inner radar is your most reliable ally in quantum jumping. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in sensations. It doesn't negotiate. It alerts. It doesn't give timelines. It gives signals. And when you hold that frequency, when you stop interpreting discomfort as danger, you learn to hear the message. You're not failing. You're crossing. That's the difference between those who abort the jump and those who land it. One mislabels static as a problem. The other recognizes static as proof. Now, the question becomes, once the radar alerts you, what do you actually do with it? How do you stop the old broadcast from hijacking the signal? That is where the practice of pattern interruption begins. End of section 3. Awaiting continue. Make one alignment move. When the static of your inner radar spikes, the temptation is to sink back into the old loop. The body remembers the path of least resistance. Fear arrives, and the nervous system tries to match it with a story. Doubt shows up, and your brain wants to replay every past failure. That's the old broadcast tightening its grip. If you let it, you collapse back into the orbit you swore you'd left. Pause, breathe. The key is not to wrestle with the old identity. Wrestling only entangles you further. The key is interruption, a sudden, decisive act that breaks the loop and severs coherence with the broadcast you're leaving behind. Neuroscience confirms this. Interrupting a pattern at the level of body or breath is the fastest way to create new neural space. So when the old emotion rises, do something physical. Stand up abruptly. Shift your posture. Inhale sharply and exhale with force. Clap your hands once like a gavel striking order into chaos. You're not being dramatic. You're disrupting circuitry. You're telling your nervous system, we will not replay this tape again. Pause, breathe. Here's why this works. Old identities run on automation. They thrive in unbroken loops. You wake, think the same thoughts, feel the same feelings, make the same choices. Each repetition strengthens the neural groove, but a sharp interruption breaks the rhythm. It jolts the system. Suddenly the loop falters, and in that brief silence, a new signal can enter. Think of a DJ scratching a record mid-beat. The dance floor freezes, ears perk, attention spikes. That interruption resets the atmosphere. You have that power with your own mind. One conscious act as simple as standing, breathing differently, or speaking aloud can jolt the groove, enough for coherence to slip in. Pause, breathe. Try this the next time doubt arrives. Say out loud, stop, not whispered, spoken with authority. Feel how the body responds to the sound. That single word is not magic, but it is interruption. It halts the automatic pilot just long enough to ask a better question. What frequency do I choose now? Or this change your physical environment. If fear spirals at your desk, step outside, put your feet on the ground. If impatience swells in your chest, lie flat and expand your breath until the body no longer matches the panic. Each interruption is a declaration that you are not enslaved to the broadcast of yesterday. Pause, breathe. And this isn't only about stopping, it's about redirecting. Once the loop is broken, you need a replacement signal. Otherwise, the old frequency sneaks back in. After the clap, after the breath, after the stop, add one alignment move. It doesn't need to be grand. It only needs to be congruent with the future you've chosen. If your broadcast is freedom, take a small action from that state. Send the text you've delayed. Cancel the obligation you resent. Stand taller. If your broadcast is abundance, spend 2 minutes in gratitude for what already sustains you. If your broadcast is love, extend one act of kindness without asking for return. These aren't random. They're coherent microacts. They amplify the new signal until the field recognizes it. Pause, breathe. Remember, the universe is mechanical in this sense. It doesn't judge whether you're worthy. It mirrors whatever you sustain. So the role of interruption is not to fight the old broadcast, but to stop feeding it. Then immediately nourish the new one. And if you practice this consistently, you'll notice a strange reversal, where once the old patterns pulled you back easily, now the interruptions become natural. The clap, the breath, the shift, they become reflexes. Soon the old loops don't grip you as tightly because your nervous system has been rewired to expect interruption. This is how pattern interruption evolves from effort into instinct. At first, it feels clumsy, like training wheels. But with practice, it becomes seamless. The moment static arises, your body responds automatically with a shift. A breath, a word, a move. You don't collapse, you pivot. Pause, breathe. This is your protocol. Break the loop, then broadcast anew. Each interruption is a spark. Each spark is energy absorbed. Each charge accumulates until the jump triggers. So the next time static hits, when you feel fear rising, when doubt claws, when impatience gnaws, remember you don't need to solve the emotion. You only need to stop its broadcast. Interruption first, alignment second. That's how you collapse the old orbit and prepare for the leap. And once the loop is broken, you step into the next phase, flooding your nervous system with coherence so the new frequency stabilizes. Hold that frequency. This is where the shift stops being theory and starts becoming sensation. Quantum jumping doesn't lock in through thinking harder or visualizing longer. It locks in when your entire nervous system is soaked in the frequency of the life you're choosing. And that means embodiment. Pause, breathe. Think of the field like a tuning fork. It doesn't measure your words. It measures your vibration. If you affirm abundance but still carry the emotion of scarcity, the fork hears scarcity. If you speak love but still vibrate with resentment, the fork resonates with resentment. The field is precise, neutral, and mechanical. It amplifies what you feel, not what you wish. This is why embodiment is non-negotiable. You can't just think your way into a jump. You must feel your way into it. And not someday in the future, now, in this body, in this moment. Here's the practice. Choose one frequency. Freedom, peace, love, power, whatever your next orbit demands. Then give yourself 90 seconds to embody it fully. Not pretend, not fantasize. Embody. How? Breathe as if it were true. Stand as if it were true. Let your muscles, your posture, your micro-expressions align with the signal of that identity. For 90 seconds, flood your nervous system with coherence. Pause, breathe. You don't need evidence, you don't need proof, you only need congruence. If your future self is confident, let your body stand taller. If your future self is free, exhale until your ribcage opens. If your future self is abundant, soften your shoulders like someone who no longer clutches every resource. At first, this feels like play acting, but then something strange happens. The body doesn't know the difference between rehearsal and reality. Neuroscience confirms this when you embody a state. Your brain wires as if it's true. You're not pretending. You're programming. This is the jump point when thought, feeling, and action collapse into one coherent signal. The field locks in. 90 seconds of congruence can do more than 90 days of wishful thinking. Pause, breathe. The secret is emotional congruence. If you say, "I am free," but your chest is tight, you're broadcasting contradiction. If you visualize wealth but feel guilt, the field mirrors the guilt. But if, for even 1 minute, you breathe freedom, stand freedom, act freedom, the signal clears, and the field, like a mirror with no delay, reflects it. This is why breakthroughs often arrive after short, decisive moments. A single conversation spoken from your new frequency changes a decade of patterns. A single decision made with congruence shatters years of hesitation. It's not the length of time that matters. It's the clarity of the broadcast. So practice embodiment daily, even briefly. Don't wait for the ritual to be perfect. Don't wait for the environment to cooperate. Sit at the edge of your bed each morning, close your eyes, and embody your future for 90 seconds. Let your breath and posture become the proof. Pause, breathe. And here's the paradox: the less you chase evidence, the more evidence shows up. Because embodiment is not about forcing the field to give you something. It's about becoming someone who no longer needs to ask. Think of it like a magnet. A magnet doesn't plead for metal to come closer. It doesn't visualize harder. It simply is. Its field radiates, and reality reorganizes around it. Your embodiment works the same way, but there's a trap. Many will try embodiment once, feel good for a moment, then collapse back into scanning for proof. They ask, "Did it work?" And in that question, they've left the frequency. The field doesn't respond to interrogation. It responds to consistency. So your task is not to prove embodiment worked. Your task is to hold it until it becomes reflex, until it feels less like effort and more like truth, until your nervous system stops asking, "Am I doing this right?" and starts broadcasting, "This is who I am." Pause, breathe. This is the staging ground. Embodiment is how you take the abstract and make it cellular. It's how you stop talking about jumps and start living them. Every 90-second flood is a rehearsal for the leap, not symbolic, not metaphorical, but real preparation at the level where physics meets flesh. And once the signal is strong enough, it begins to pull reality with it. But that requires more than internal coherence. It requires external demonstration. The next stage of the jump is action, not to prove, but to entangle. Watch the field respond. You've embodied the frequency. You've felt it in your bones, breathed it into your chest, carried it in your posture. But embodiment alone is not the full jump. It's the ignition. What makes the signal measurable to the field is action, not just any action, aligned action. Small, some precise moves that entangle your broadcast with reality until the field has no choice but to mirror it back. Pause, breathe. Think of entanglement in quantum physics. Two particles once connected can influence each other instantly. No matter the distance, change one and the other shifts. The same principle applies to you and your future timeline. When you take an action congruent with your new broadcast, you entangle your present with the coordinates of your next reality. you send a signal that the field cannot ignore. And here's the key: the action doesn't need to be grand. In fact, small, congruent acts are often more powerful than massive leaps taken in fear. A message you finally send, a boundary you uphold without apology, a single no to what drains you. These are not minor gestures, they're energetic signatures that prove you're living from the broadcast of your chosen identity. Pause, breathe. Ask yourself, what would my future self do today? Then act as if, not pretending, not forcing, simply choosing from the coherence you've already embodied. If the future you is confident, maybe today's action is speaking up once in a meeting. If the future you is abundant, maybe today's action is tipping generously, even when no one is watching. If the future you is free, maybe today's action is walking away from a conversation that chains you to the old story. Each action is a micro-broadcast, a measurable signal, and the field listens. This is why quantum jumps often seem to be followed by coincidences. You take one aligned action, and suddenly opportunities surface, people appear, doors crack open. It's not luck, it's entanglement. You sent a frequency so congruent that the field responded with matching proof. Pause, breathe. But here's where many sabotage themselves. They act for proof, not from identity. They say, I'll do this new thing, and if it works, I'll keep going. That's not alignment, that's bargaining. And the field doesn't respond to bargains, it responds to coherence. So make your actions proof of identity, not tests of outcome. When you act congruently, the act itself is the reward, whether or not the world claps. Whether or not results show up immediately, you've already shifted, because your nervous system has entangled itself with your future broadcast. This is why aligned actions often feel liberating regardless of external results. Quitting the draining job doesn't just change your schedule, it changes your field. Ending the toxic relationship doesn't just free your calendar, it frees your frequency. Writing the book draft, even unread, shifts your signal to author, whether or not a publisher calls tomorrow. Pause, breathe, and don't underestimate the compounding effect. One congruent act is a spark. A series of congruent acts builds momentum. Soon the field doesn't just mirror your actions, it begins reorganizing your environment to match them. That's when synchronicities multiply, when opportunities stack, when conversations appear in uncanny timing, not because you forced it, because you consistently broadcasted it. So here's your practice each day. Make one action that belongs to your future self. Not 10, not a list that overwhelms you. 1. Consistency beats intensity. 1,000 tiny proofs of coherence are more powerful than one dramatic gesture followed by collapse. Pause, breathe. Remember, transmitters don't chase evidence. They don't beg the field for response. They broadcast, act, and trust entanglement to handle the rest. That's the discipline of quantum jumping. You're not acting for applause. You're acting for coherence. And when you start living like this, you'll notice something strange you no longer need to ask, whether the jump is working. You'll feel it in the way life bends to meet you, the way conversations shift tone, the way chance begins to feel like orchestration. Action is how you tell the field, this isn't a wish, this is who I am. And once that declaration becomes consistent, the entanglement strengthens. The new timeline pulls tighter, the jump stabilizes. Pause, breathe. But the journey doesn't end there. If alignment through action were the only key, everyone would hold their new frequency with ease. Yet many collapse after the first taste of proof. They sabotage their own broadcast without realizing it. To stay in signal, you must learn how to name and neutralize sabotage before it unravels your leap. Name the sabotage you've broadcasted, you've embodied. You've acted. And then, just as the field begins to stir, something old slips in through the back door. Doubt, impatience, nostalgia, guilt, one subtle misstep, and suddenly the new frequency collapses back into the orbit you thought you'd left. This is the sabotage loop. Pause, breathe. Let's be clear, sabotage isn't always dramatic. It rarely announces itself as "I'm here to ruin your jump." It arrives disguised as logic, caution, or even humility. But beneath those masks, it's the same force, the old identity clawing for survival. There are 5 main saboteurs. Learn to recognize them, and you strip them of their power. First, proof-seeking. You broadcast a new frequency. Feel aligned for a moment, then immediately scan reality for confirmation. Did it work yet? Where's the sign? Where's the outcome? The moment you measure, you collapse. Just as in quantum physics, the act of observing a particle changes its state. The act of demanding proof shifts you back into the old frequency. The field isn't punishing you. It's reflecting the doubt you broadcasted. Pause, breathe. Second, guilt. You step into freedom, but then a voice whispers, "Who are you to leave them behind? Who are you to succeed while others still struggle?" That guilt isn't noble, it's a leash. It binds you to the orbit of an old self, keeping you from fully entangling with your future. The truth, your leap doesn't abandon anyone. It broadcasts a signal that can lift others if they choose to align. Third, social gravity. Old friends, colleagues, or even family members notice your shift. They tease, question, or guilt trip you back into sameness. They don't mean harm, but their frequency is calibrated to the old you. If you collapse under their gravity, you signal to the field that the old orbit still claims you. To resist, you don't need to fight them. You need to stop auditioning for their validation. Pause, breathe. Fourth, nostalgia. The past replays with golden light. You remember the good times, the comfort, the familiar rituals. Nostalgia edits the pain out of memory, leaving only sweetness, tempting you back. But nostalgia is often a liar. It whispers about the warmth of yesterday without mentioning the cage it kept you in. Recognize it for what it is. A filter, not the full truth. Fifth, impatience. The field reorganizes at its own pace. When proof doesn't arrive instantly, you interpret the silence as failure. You think, maybe I did it wrong. So you revert. You stop broadcasting. You shrink back to what's familiar. Impatience is sabotage in disguise. The silence is not absence, it's alignment. Pause, breathe. So how do you neutralize these saboteurs first? Name them. Awareness is power. If you feel restless, ask, is this impatience? If you feel heavy, ask, is this guilt? If you find yourself scrolling for evidence, call it proof-seeking. Naming interrupts their invisibility. Second, interrupt the broadcast. The moment you catch a saboteur, act physically, shift posture, breathe deeply, speak a declaration. This breaks the loop and creates space for a new choice. Third, replace with coherence. After interruption, anchor back into the broadcast of your future self. Even 1 minute of embodiment realigns you faster than hours of spiraling in sabotage. Pause, breathe. Here's the paradox: sabotage is not failure. It is feedback. Each time an old pattern rises, it's not proof you've lost the jump. It's proof that you're close to locking it in. The old orbit fights hardest right before it loses you. Recognize this, and sabotage transforms from threat to confirmation. Think of it like turbulence during takeoff. The plane shakes most violently as it lifts from the ground. Once altitude is reached, the ride smooths. Your sabotage loop is turbulence. Not a sign to abort, a sign you're rising. Pause, breathe. So don't fear sabotage. Expect it. When you know the five forms, you stop being blindsided. You meet proof-seeking with patience. You meet guilt with self-permission. You meet social gravity with quiet boundaries. You meet nostalgia with truth. You meet impatience with trust. And when you consistently respond this way, something shifts. Sabotage loses its teeth. It becomes background noise rather than a derailment. The field registers your steadiness, and your new frequency stabilizes. This is how you stop sabotaging your own leap. Not by eliminating every old thought, but by refusing to broadcast them. By catching them, naming them, interrupting them, and returning to coherence. Pause, breathe. Once you've named and neutralized sabotage, you're ready for the most misunderstood phase of the jump, the reorganization. The silence, the void where the old timeline has collapsed but the new hasn't fully landed yet. This is the stage most interpret as failure when in truth, it's the greatest proof you're already airborne. Do not look for proof. This is the part that unravels most people. You've embodied, acted, interrupted sabotage, and suddenly life feels like it's falling apart. Conversations no longer click. Old routines lose flavor. Relationships feel distant. Work feels foreign. You stand in the middle of your life, and instead of clarity, you feel like everything is dissolving. This is not regression. This is reorganization. Pause, breathe. Think of what happens when you change radio stations. As you turn the dial, the old song fades into static before the new one comes in clear. For a moment, it sounds like nothing is playing, like silence has hijacked the airwaves. That silence is not emptiness. It's the field recalibrating to your new frequency. But here's where people collapse. They interpret the void as proof of failure. They think, if my jump worked, why does everything feel hollow? Why do I feel so alone? They misread the absence of old alignments as evidence of loss instead of evidence of resonance. Correction. Pause, breathe. Understand this. Your new frequency doesn't just attract what belongs to it. It repels what doesn't. When you step into a new broadcast, anything entangled with the old version of you can no longer stick. That's why people drift. That's why opportunities dissolve. That's why habits feel suddenly intolerable. This is not punishment, it's purification. The field is clearing the static, cutting cords, pruning attachments so your new broadcast can stabilize without interference. Think of it like moving homes. You pack your boxes, leave the old house, and for a moment, you're in neither place. Your furniture is in transit. Your body feels displaced. You miss the familiarity of the old rooms, even if they were cramped. You haven't yet settled into the new ones. That gap is uncomfortable, but it is temporary. Pause, breathe. This in-between is what mystics call the void. It feels like silence, like suspension. But silence is not absence, it's gestation. The field is rearranging, building the scaffolding of your new reality, brick by brick, frequency by frequency. Your job in the void is not to demand proof. It's to remain in broadcast, to keep radiating coherence even when no evidence has landed. The test is not whether you can jump. The test is whether you can stay. This is why so many sabotage themselves here. They feel the silence, interpret it as failure, and crawl back to the old orbit. They reconnect with the people they left, resurrect the habits they dropped, accept the limitations they outgrew, and in doing so, they collapse the new timeline before it stabilizes. Pause, breathe. So how do you survive the void without collapsing? You shift your interpretation. Instead of asking, why is nothing happening, you ask, what is being cleared? Instead of saying, This silence means I failed. You declare. This silence means the field is still building. You learn to love the neutrality. You stop craving drama. You let the boredom itself be proof that the old identity is no longer active. And here's the secret: the void always feels longer than it is. In hindsight, you'll see it was only days or weeks. But in the moment, it feels like forever because the old anchors have been cut and the new anchors aren't visible yet. That floating sensation is the essence of the jump. Pause, breathe. Think of a rocket. The most chaotic moment isn't liftoff or orbit. It's the in-between, when the boosters detach, when the atmosphere shakes the vessel, when everything rattles as it pierces the sky. That's the reorganization phase, not a crash, a passage. And if you hold the frequency steady here, if you resist the temptation to chase proof or resurrect the past, the new timeline eventually locks in. Slowly at first. A conversation that feels different. An opportunity that comes out of nowhere. A synchronicity so uncanny it makes you laugh. Then momentum builds. Then clarity arrives. Pause, breathe. The reorganization phase is not a detour. It's the bridge the mind thought didn't exist. Not linear, not predictable, but necessary. The silence you fear is the very proof you asked for. It means the old broadcast has collapsed. It means the new broadcast is stabilizing. So stop looking for evidence in the void. Stop calling it failure. Call it recalibration. Call it the sacred in-between. Call it what it is, the universe tuning itself to the note you've chosen to hold. And when you can stay steady in that note long enough, the field stops resisting. It sinks, it reflects, it delivers. This is how you anchor beyond turbulence. But anchoring isn't a one-time event. It's a discipline, a daily ritual of coherence. Which brings us to the next stage, the practices that transform momentary broadcasts into nervous system defaults. Return to the signal. By now you've seen the pattern embodiment sparks the jump. Aligned action entangles it, and surviving the void keeps it alive. But to remain in your new orbit long enough for reality to fully lock in, you need more than a single leap. You need anchors. Pause, breathe. Anchoring is the art of repetition. It's how you convert fleeting broadcasts into your nervous system's default. Without anchors, even the strongest coherence slips away under pressure. With anchors, the new frequency stabilizes until it feels natural, effortless, permanent. So what anchors actually work? Let's map 3 categories: morning rituals, micro reset cues, and decision architecture. Morning rituals. The first minutes of your day are the most programmable. Wakefulness is when the old identity tries to reassert itself, feeding you the same thoughts, anxieties, and habits as yesterday. To interrupt this, design a ritual that stamps your broadcast onto your system before the day begins. It doesn't have to be long. Sit upright, close your eyes, and ask, what version of me am I broadcasting today? Let the answer come as a posture, a breath, a word. Hold it for 2 minutes. That's it. Those 2 minutes are a declaration to the field. This is who I am, and I will carry this frequency into every interaction. Pause, breathe, micro reset cues. No matter how strong your morning ritual, interference will spike during the day. Static rises, old patterns return. This is where micro resets matter. They're small, repeatable actions that pull you back into signal in seconds. Choose a cue. It could be placing your hand on your chest and exhaling once slowly. It could be saying a phrase aloud, return to signal. It could be standing taller, lifting your gaze each time you feel sabotage or static. Use the cue, interrupt, reset, rebroadcast. The more often you do this, the faster your nervous system learns to stabilize in the new frequency. Decision architecture. Anchoring is not just about rituals. It's about designing your choices to reinforce the broadcast. If your future self values freedom, then structure your schedule with breathing space, not back-to-back obligations. If your future self is abundant, then make decisions that flow from sufficiency rather than fear. Each choice is a vote, enough votes, and the broadcast becomes law in your nervous system. Pause, breathe. The most powerful anchors are not grand ceremonies. They're simple repetitions, and they compound. Imagine brushing your teeth. You don't do it once and declare your dental health permanent. You repeat it daily until it becomes reflex. Anchoring works the same way. You repeat the broadcast until it becomes identity, and then you no longer need to remind yourself because it is you. And here's the paradox: anchoring often feels boring. Without the drama of collapse or the thrill of leaps, repetition can seem unremarkable. But boredom is not failure. Boredom is stability. It means the new frequency has settled so deeply that it no longer feels novel. That's not the end of the jump. That's the sign it worked. Pause, breathe. But don't confuse anchoring with clinging. Anchoring is about steady repetition, not desperate attachment. If you force the signal, if you grasp for perfection, you slip into anxiety, which is a broadcast of scarcity. True anchoring is relaxed, rhythmic, and consistent, like a heartbeat, like breathing, in and out, day after day. Here's a practice before sleep. Replay the day and name one moment where you broadcasted your future self. No judgment if there were slips. No scolding, just recognition. There, that was coherence. This simple act trains your nervous system to notice alignment instead of obsessing over sabotage. Over time, you build an internal library of proof, and the broadcast strengthens without effort. Pause, breathe. Anchoring is how you graduate from wishful thinker to steady transmitter. It's how you stop chasing proof and start becoming it. Each ritual, each reset, each choice is a thread in the web of your new identity. Weave enough threads and the web holds you automatically. And when anchoring becomes second nature, you stop asking, how do I keep the jump alive? Because the jump isn't something you maintain. It's something you become. Now comes the final layer: understanding identity, not as a fragile mood, but as infrastructure, the code that structures your entire frequency. Once you see identity this way, you'll know how to update it deliberately, without collapsing into the old orbit. Hold that frequency. Here's the truth most people overlook. Your identity is not just a story you tell yourself. It's not simply a collection of memories or preferences. It's infrastructure, a living code that structures how your nervous system fires, how your emotions flow, and how the field reads your signal. If you want your jump to last, you can't treat identity like a costume. You must treat it like the architecture of your reality. Pause, breathe. Think of identity as the operating system of a computer. The programs you run, jobs, relationships, goals, all depend on the underlying code. You can install new apps, but if the OS stays outdated, glitches appear. The system slows, crashes, reverts. The same is true for you. If you try to run a new life on the operating system of an old self, the broadcast collapses. This is why jumps fail for so many. They upgrade a single behavior, but keep the old identity intact. They make more money, but still broadcast scarcity. They change partners, but still carry abandonment frequency. They achieve goals, but still vibrate with unworthiness. The field listens to the infrastructure, not the surface. Pause, breathe. So how do you update identity at the level of infrastructure? You start by asking, what code am I running? Not in vague terms, but specifically, do I operate from the belief I must prove my worth? Do I carry the frequency life is hard? Do I rehearse the signal I always end up alone? Each of these is a line of code, and as long as the code runs, the broadcast repeats. Next, you collapse the old code by withdrawing energy from it. Identity survives through rehearsal. Every time you think the same thought, feel the same emotion, or tell the same story, you feed the code. When you stop rehearsing, the code starves. This is why silence, neutrality, and stillness are so powerful. They strip fuel from expired programs. Pause, breathe, then you install the new code, not through willpower, but through coherence. If the new identity is I am free, then every choice, every action, every breath must hum with freedom, not perfection, but congruence. The field doesn't need volume, it needs clarity. Even 2 minutes of pure congruence can rewire faster than years of half-hearted effort. Identity as infrastructure means you don't act as if occasionally. You stop broadcasting from the vantage point of who you were and begin broadcasting from the vantage point of who you are choosing to be, day after day, choice after choice, until the nervous system stabilizes and the field mirrors it without delay. Pause, breathe. And here's the paradox: when the new identity is installed, life stops feeling like a chase. You no longer strain to maintain the jump because the jump is no longer separate from you. It becomes your baseline. You wake up and the old thoughts don't even occur. You respond to challenges with a new rhythm. You don't have to remember to stay in signal because you are the signal. Identity becomes infrastructure when your frequency outlives your effort. Pause, breathe. So test yourself. Ask what choices today came from the old code, what choices came from the new. No judgment, just awareness. Over time, the balance shifts. More and more, your actions and emotions will flow from the new architecture, and when that tipping point arrives, the jump stops being fragile. It becomes permanent. This is the difference between wishing and becoming. Wishing asks the field to rearrange while you stay the same. Becoming forces the field to rearrange because you are no longer the person you were. That is identity as infrastructure. Pause, breathe. So remember, you don't find your new life by fixing the old one. You find it by ceasing to broadcast as the self who needed it fixed. You update the operating system, and suddenly, everything changes without you pushing, because the field is mechanical in its precision. It mirrors the infrastructure, not the excuses. And when you live this way, when you treat identity as code, as infrastructure, as the architecture of your broadcast, you stop fearing collapse. You know that even if turbulence comes, even if sabotage whispers, even if silence stretches, the infrastructure holds, because you've become the jump itself. This is the moment when quantum jumping ceases to be an idea and becomes a lifestyle, not a trick, not a metaphor, a real process, a new orbit, a permanent broadcast. Pause, breathe. Now you're ready to land the jump and soften into the wind down, where we seal this transmission into your nervous system with clarity, compassion, and a simple ritual you can carry into tomorrow. Pause, breathe. You've walked the entire arc, from silence as signal, to physics as practice, to radar, interruption, embodiment, action, sabotage, void, anchoring, and identity as infrastructure. You've seen how a quantum jump is not metaphor, but process, not wishful thinking, but vibrational precision. And now, we slow down, because the real power of everything you've heard isn't in the theory. It's in the smallest choices you make after this. The way you breathe tomorrow morning before you check your phone. The way you catch yourself in doubt and interrupt it. The way you choose to embody your future self for 90 seconds instead of rehearsing your past. Pause, breathe. The jump is not a destination, it is a posture. A daily decision to stop broadcasting from who you were and begin broadcasting from who you are becoming. The field doesn't require perfection. It requires coherence, even brief, even imperfect, even subtle coherence is what locks the orbit. So tonight, try something simple. Close your eyes for 1 minute. Ask yourself quietly, what version of me am I broadcasting now? Don't overthink it. Let the answer come as a feeling, a posture, a breath, then hold it. Just long enough for the nervous system to feel, this is me, this is real, this is signal. Pause, breathe. And when the static rises tomorrow, when sabotage whispers, when silence stretches, you'll remember this isn't failure. This is reorganization. This is resonance correcting itself. Your only task is to return to the signal, again and again, until it becomes who you are. No one else can choose it for you. But once you choose, the field responds, quietly at first, then rhythmically, then inevitably. So let this be your anchor. You don't have to force the jump. You are the jump. And the moment you embody that truth, reality bends to meet you. Pause, breathe. If this message resonates, carry it into your life. Share it with someone who needs to remember their own signal. And know this, the jump has already begun.